2 weeks ago, the Queen and I were
For decades, everything remained hidden behind palace walls. Then, without warning, everything shifted. There were no loud confrontations echoing through the corridors. Instead, the palace fell into an unsettling silence. Away from public view, King Charles faced the decision many believed he would never make, removing several key royal privileges from Camilla after an internal palace revolt reached the highest level of the monarchy. What started as quiet dissatisfaction gradually transformed into a serious institutional conflict. At the center of that storm stood Earl Spencer, bringing Diana's legacy back into the spotlight with remarkable force. Before we reveal what this dramatic development could mean for the future of the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you never miss our latest royal updates. Charles studied the final recommendation in complete solitude. The silence surrounding him felt heavier than any criticism. His hand rested on the document, yet he hesitated before turning the page. The king knew that a single signature would deeply affect Camilla, create divisions within the royal household, and confirm that the palace rebellion had gone far beyond quiet disagreement. Queen rights refer to the ceremonial privileges, official access, and public responsibilities connected to the Queen's position beside the reigning monarch. While these privileges do not create laws, they influence visibility, precedence, public authority, and private access within the royal institution. Earl Spencer changed the entire situation because his objection carried the enduring legacy of Princess Diana directly into the heart of Buckingham Palace. Through a confidential written memorandum, he transformed private concerns into something far more serious, a challenge centered on public confidence, historical memory, and a chapter the monarchy had never fully managed to leave behind. A memorandum is an official written document used within an institution to record concerns, recommendations, or important decisions. This particular memorandum revealed that several senior palace officials supported Spencer's position, making it clear that the issue was no longer a personal family disagreement. It had evolved into a full institutional challenge. Camilla received the news inside a private sitting room. Before the senior aide even finished explaining the decision, her expression hardened. A private sitting room is a smaller royal space reserved for confidential conversations away from public ceremony, making the moment feel deeply personal rather than publicly humiliating. She was informed that her access to certain state privileges, advisory responsibilities, and senior ceremonial precedence had already been reduced. State privileges are special permissions linked to official royal duties, while ceremonial precedence determines the order of recognition, arrival, and placement during formal royal events. Camilla immediately realized the decision had already moved beyond discussion. Charles had signed the order without offering her one final opportunity to respond. That realization hurt more than anything else. The king had not simply delayed the inevitable. He had acted. Spencer may have forced the crown into this position, but it was Charles who ultimately placed his signature on the document. As Camilla remained seated in stunned silence, the palace quietly shifted its attention toward those whose long-hidden personal pain had finally become a matter of royal consequence. Every major royal controversy leaves behind official papers, signatures, and carefully chosen statements. But this one was also deeply personal. Charles found himself divided between responsibility and loyalty. Camilla suddenly faced uncertainty inside the very palace that had once protected her. Earl Spencer carried Diana's memory with quiet determination, while Prince William watched as long-buried tensions returned, no longer as memories but as consequences. Charles sensed the atmosphere had changed before anyone even spoke. As king, he carried the responsibility of preserving stability within the monarchy because the institution survives only when its traditions appear stronger than personal relationships. As Camilla's husband, however, he understood that she would likely feel isolated, diminished, and abandoned by the person she trusted most. Palace stability simply means the royal household's ability to operate without internal conflict damaging public confidence or weakening royal authority. That became especially important because the restrictions placed on Camilla were about more than her individual position. They reflected whether the monarchy could maintain its ceremonial order when private loyalties collided with powerful public memories. Camilla slowly removed her reading glasses after hearing the details of the decision. At first, she said nothing. She simply remained seated, absorbing every word as the reality settled in. For years, the Queen Consort had worked to establish a place within royal life, yet that place had narrowed through a single authorized decision. Her title remained intact, but her influence had clearly been reduced. Her dignity remained, but the protection surrounding her position had weakened. The silence in that room carried far more weight than raised voices ever could. Earl Spencer entered the dispute with an authority that few inside the palace could ignore. As Diana's brother, his influence came not only from family connection but from the unresolved emotions surrounding his sister's legacy and the lasting public affection attached to her memory. His challenge was never presented as an act of revenge. Instead, Spencer argued that the institution could no longer overlook the emotional consequences of its past decisions. By bringing Diana's legacy back into the center of the conversation, he forced Charles to confront an issue the monarchy had struggled to leave behind. When William later spoke privately with his father, he chose every word with great care. The prince understood that every response, whether support, silence, or hesitation, could shape the future reign that many already expected him to inherit. He did not encourage hostility. He argued for clear boundaries and institutional discipline. Senior palace aides had also discovered that Spencer's complaint gained additional momentum after several staff members privately expressed concerns about Camilla's growing influence over royal protocol, the system governing ceremonies, titles, official access, and precedence. Once those concerns became connected to Diana's legacy, the disagreement could no longer be dismissed as the frustration of one individual. Charles now faced pressure from every direction. Camilla expected loyalty. Spencer demanded accountability. William emphasized discipline. The crown required stability. Yet the true cause of the crisis was not simply a disagreement over policy. Everything traced back to one particular incident that transformed quiet frustration into open resistance. To understand why Charles ultimately acted, the palace had to revisit the single moment many insiders would later describe as the true breaking point. The palace revolt did not begin inside a courtroom, a council chamber, or during a public controversy. It started at a private memorial dinner where one empty chair, one quiet remark, and one uncomfortable silence altered everything. Those who attended would later recall how the atmosphere suddenly changed as Earl Spencer looked across the table and realized that Diana's place within royal memory appeared to be quietly shifting, softened, managed, and gradually pushed aside. Spencer noticed the difference before anyone offered an explanation. His place card had been moved away from the central family position, leaving him seated where his presence seemed more symbolic than significant. A private memorial dinner is a closed gathering held among family members to honor someone's memory away from cameras, speeches, and official ceremonies. This particular occasion carried special importance because it was held in remembrance of Diana at Kensington, a place forever connected to her life, her sons, and the public affection that still surrounds her legacy. Spencer understood that seating arrangements at such an event were never random. They represented meaning. They quietly reflected whose memory remained central and whose grief had been placed at a respectful distance. William noticed the card in Spencer's hand and immediately sensed the growing tension. He knew this was far more than a simple seating adjustment. A seating plan, simply explained, determines where guests are placed, but inside royal circles it often reflects status, relationships, and emotional significance. Camilla's office reportedly described the adjustment as nothing more than a protocol revision, a routine administrative change designed to preserve order and formality. Spencer, however, interpreted it very differently. To him, the decision pushed Diana's family away from the center of remembrance, turning close relatives into little more than invited observers. No polite explanation could erase that message. Spencer did not raise his voice. He quietly held the place card for several moments while the room waited in complete silence. William watched carefully, recognizing that an old wound was reopening before everyone's eyes. For years, Diana's memory had existed between public admiration and palace discomfort. Now, one seemingly small change had exposed that unresolved conflict once again. William understood that if the issue remained unaddressed, it would eventually return in a far more damaging form. A palace aide later acknowledged in an internal report that the seating adjustment had originated from Camilla's office. That single detail transformed the situation. What might have appeared to be an innocent social oversight suddenly became the first documented event that fueled the palace revolt. Camilla may never have intended the arrangement to trigger such consequences, but Spencer viewed it as clear evidence that her ceremonial influence had begun extending into spaces connected with Diana's legacy. Once Diana's memory became part of the dispute, the palace could no longer dismiss the issue as ordinary household tension. Spencer quietly left the dinner before it ended. He caused no public scene because he understood that silence often carries greater impact when followed by deliberate action. The following morning, he submitted a confidential letter requesting a formal review of Camilla's ceremonial authority, her influence over memorial traditions, and her role in shaping events connected to Diana's place in royal history. That letter became the first link in a chain of events that ultimately placed Charles and Camilla on opposite sides of a closed palace door. Once Spencer's message reached the king, a private grievance quickly evolved into a confrontation that no one inside the royal household could quietly contain. There are moments that reshape a family, and then there are moments that reshape an entire monarchy. Charles and Camilla met privately, away from cameras, advisors, and the familiar royal habit of hiding difficult conversations behind formal ceremony. Between them rested a single folder containing the complaint, the recommendations, the supporting documents, and the signature that would permanently alter her position within the palace. Charles had asked Camilla to meet before the decision became widely known inside the royal household, but not before it officially took effect. That distinction mattered. A royal order, simply explained, is an internal directive approved by the monarch that determines how royal access, privileges, or ceremonial responsibilities will be managed. This particular order had already moved beyond discussion. It included Spencer's memorandum, statements from palace staff, and the final recommendation reducing Camilla's ceremonial privileges, advisory involvement, and formal precedence associated with her role beside the king. Charles wanted the meeting to feel personal. The folder resting between them made it unmistakably official. Camilla recognized the seriousness of the situation the moment she saw the documents arranged before her. Rather than asking about titles, residences, or ceremonial duties, she asked Charles a far more personal question. "Do you truly believe I betrayed the institution?" The question struck him deeply because it required the answer of a husband. Yet the only response he could offer was shaped by the decision he had already approved. He remained silent for several long moments. That silence told Camilla more than any carefully chosen explanation ever could. Charles never used the word betrayal, but by approving the recommendation, he had accepted that her growing influence had become a concern for the institution. Instead of reaching for her hand, Charles quietly placed his pen on the table. That small gesture carried enormous meaning. The husband who loved Camilla was still present, but the sovereign had stepped ahead of him. A sovereign is the reigning monarch responsible for protecting royal authority, constitutional duty, and public confidence. Charles understood that showing compassion too quickly could be interpreted as weakness. Camilla understood that withholding it suggested the crown had taken priority over their personal bond. Then the reality became impossible to ignore. The decision had already been finalized. There would be no debate, no negotiation, and no final appeal. Camilla slowly realized that the complaint had moved beyond explanation and defense. Charles had not invited her there to save her privileges. He had invited her to witness their removal. Then Charles shared one final detail, and it proved even more painful than the order itself. William had been informed before she was. The future king already knew the direction of the decision, while Camilla still believed she might have an opportunity to influence it. That revelation left her feeling completely isolated within the very household where she had once expected protection. Spencer had reopened the past. William had been prepared for the future. Charles had permanently changed the present. Without asking another question, Camilla quietly stood and walked toward the door. Charles made no attempt to stop her because nothing he could say would erase the signature already placed on the document. The conversation had revealed the emotional cost of the decision. Now, the palace itself was about to reveal the power behind it. The most significant decisions inside a palace are rarely made by a single individual. They emerge through discussions among private secretaries, legal advisors, senior members of the royal household, and the quiet influence of history itself. Charles may have signed the order, but long before the pen touched the paper, the recommendation had already passed through a carefully guarded network of royal advisors. Earl Spencer ignited the issue, yet others ensured it continued gathering momentum. Charles understood that the recommendation had grown beyond personal emotion. A palace advisory group, simply explained, is a small circle of trusted officials and senior advisors who examine highly sensitive royal matters before they reach the monarch. This group concluded that limiting Camilla's ceremonial authority was necessary to protect the monarchy's long-term credibility. Credibility is the public confidence that allows the monarchy to retain its authority, even during periods of internal controversy. If people believed Charles placed personal loyalty above institutional responsibility, confidence in the crown itself could begin to weaken. Ignoring the recommendation would not end the revolt. It would almost certainly intensify it. William's quiet support added another layer of pressure. The prince never needed to dominate the conversation because his role as the future monarch naturally carried significant influence. The issue had grown beyond Camilla's present position. It now involved succession, public trust, and the kind of monarchy William would eventually inherit. According to a documented household account, William privately wrote that the future of the crown could not rest upon unresolved resentment. That single sentence carried considerable weight. It connected Spencer's complaint directly to the stability of the next generation and moved Charles one step closer to making his final decision. One senior courtier watched Charles repeatedly study the words ceremonial limitation and noticed the visible regret on the king's face. A ceremonial limitation refers to an official restriction placed upon someone's role, access, or formal precedence during royal events. Although the phrase sounded measured and administrative, everyone present understood its true impact. It would reduce Camilla's influence, protect the institution from further criticism, and deeply affect the woman Charles had spent years bringing fully into royal life. Meanwhile, Earl Spencer waited quietly at a nearby residence. He did not celebrate. The legal advisers delivered one final warning. If Charles later reversed the decision, the monarchy would appear uncertain and divided, exposing deeper fractures within the royal household. The king now faced a choice with no comfortable outcome. If he acted, Camilla would suffer. If he refused, the institution itself could suffer. Ultimately, Charles made his decision. Spencer's memorandum, William's recommendation, the advisers' conclusions, and the legal guidance all came together in one carefully written royal directive. The order officially took effect. From that moment forward, Camilla would no longer experience the decision as words written on paper. She would begin living with its consequences every single day. Power had been expressed through carefully chosen words, but its effects became painfully real the moment Camilla faced her new reality. The first indication that her authority had been reduced did not arrive through a public announcement or dramatic ceremony. It came at a familiar doorway, one she had passed through countless times without hesitation. This time, however, a palace officer stepped forward with visible discomfort and quietly explained that her access had changed. In that single moment, what had once been written as official language became something personal, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. Camilla remained motionless with her hand resting near the door. The silence surrounding her felt almost unbearable. The restricted ceremonial planning room, simply explained, was a private palace area where trusted royal figures and senior officials discussed sensitive arrangements before important state occasions. These rooms represented far more than planning. They reflected confidence, authority, and influence. Decisions about ceremonial order, privileged information, and royal responsibilities were often shaped there long before the public ever witnessed the final event. As queen consort, Camilla had always entered that room without question. Now, entry required approval. The palace officer quietly informed her that any future access would need direct authorization from Charles's office. That detail hurt more than the refusal itself. It confirmed that the restriction was no longer symbolic. It had become active. Nearby staff members lowered their eyes, avoiding the uncomfortable moment. Their silence spoke volumes, revealing the embarrassment Camilla refused to show openly. She did not argue. She understood that losing her composure would only make the situation more memorable, so she accepted the humiliation with quiet dignity. Later, when Charles received the report, he closed his eyes for several moments. He had expected the decision to cause pain. But anticipating suffering is very different from witnessing its consequences unfold. The order had now moved beyond private paperwork. It had become visible throughout the palace. Staff members knew. Senior advisers knew. The atmosphere had changed. That mattered because royal authority often survives through routine. Once palace staff begin treating someone differently, their previous standing has already begun to fade. Soon afterward, Camilla's name quietly disappeared from several internal protocol documents. A protocol sheet is an internal working document that identifies who attends briefings, receives confidential information, and participates in ceremonial planning. Those updated records removed her from selected committees and planning meetings where she had once played an active role beside Charles. Then another adjustment made the future direction unmistakably clear. William would attend one of the key briefings in her place. His presence signaled that influence inside the palace was gradually shifting toward the next generation. As Camilla's responsibilities continued to narrow, she felt the institution itself slowly pulling away from her, one quiet step after another. Charles had signed the order. Spencer had initiated the reckoning. William had moved closer to the center of royal authority. And Camilla, once protected simply by standing beside the throne, now found herself viewed from a growing distance. Yet just when isolation seemed to define the entire crisis, one private conversation unexpectedly changed its emotional course. After the first door quietly closed, the next turning point arrived not through another official document, but through an honest conversation between a father and his son. The palace had expected anger. It had expected resistance. It had expected Camilla to challenge the decision through every remaining private channel available to her. Instead, the next turning point came inside a quiet room where Charles and William met alone, without advisors, official statements, or ceremonial formality. For the first time, the king was no longer defending his decision. He was confronting the emotional price of making it. Charles met William after the restrictions on Camilla had already begun spreading through the palace like a silent shockwave. By then, he understood the situation no longer belonged solely to his marriage. It had become a matter of the monarchy's future. An access restriction, simply explained, means limiting someone's ability to enter certain royal areas, receive confidential briefings, or participate in important ceremonial decisions. That mattered because Camilla's reduced authority had now become visible throughout the palace. Staff members, advisors, and senior royals all recognized that what had started as a private directive had become an unmistakable institutional signal. Charles admitted that he had delayed acting because he feared hurting Camilla. Now he realized that the delay itself had only made the pain greater. William approached the conversation with care. He was not there to oppose Camilla. He was there as the future king, determined to prevent another generation from inheriting years of unresolved resentment. The prince understood that buried pain never truly disappears inside a royal household. It waits. It grows. Eventually, it returns through letters, protocol disputes, seating arrangements, and public scrutiny. Earl Spencer had forced the issue into the open, but William believed Spencer had simply exposed emotions that years of silence had allowed to accumulate. That was why he listened carefully as Charles admitted the truth. Love had made discipline feel almost impossible. William offered no criticism. Instead, he quietly replied with words that carried even greater weight. Sometimes protecting the crown means accepting pain instead of hiding it. The crown, simply explained, represents the monarchy itself, its authority, responsibility, public trust, and continuity beyond any individual member of the royal family. Charles understood exactly what his son meant. Camilla's dignity mattered. Diana's memory mattered. Spencer's concerns mattered. But the institution could no longer preserve stability by pretending those wounds no longer existed. Then Charles revealed the decision that changed everything. He would not restore the privileges that had been removed. The restrictions would remain in place. Camilla would continue standing beside him as queen consort, but the ceremonial authority that had been withdrawn would not be returned. William accepted the decision with quiet seriousness rather than satisfaction. He agreed to help steady public reaction, but only if the palace acknowledged the deeper emotional reasons behind the revolt. It could not simply be presented as an administrative procedure. History itself had demanded accountability. Charles realized that his son was no longer offering advice. He was helping define the values of the next reign. The family may have reached a private understanding, but peace inside the palace could not prevent the outside world from forming its own judgment. Although the palace had reached its own conclusion behind closed doors, the country was preparing to deliver a judgment of its own. By the following morning, the story had escaped the palace walls. What had begun as quiet discussions inside royal corridors quickly became newspaper headlines, television debates, and conversations across Britain. One front-page headline captured the atmosphere with striking simplicity. Beside a photograph of Camilla looking away appeared the words, "The Crown chooses memory." That image represented far more than royal protocol. It represented accountability. The public learned about the decision piece by piece, and every new detail made the situation feel even more significant. Reports revealed that Charles had reduced several of Camilla's key ceremonial privileges following an internal palace revolt led by Earl Spencer. Queen rights, simply explained, refer to the ceremonial privileges, advisory access, and official precedence connected to the queen consort's position beside the reigning monarch. That distinction mattered because Camilla had not lost her title. She had lost much of the influence that gave the title its practical authority inside the palace. The public quickly recognized the difference. A royal title may remain unchanged while the power attached to it quietly becomes far more limited. Television commentators described the situation as a direct collision between Diana's legacy, Camilla's position, and the monarchy's effort to restore public confidence. Diana's legacy, in simple terms, represents the lasting public memory of her life, compassion, popularity, and lasting influence on royal history. That legacy continued to shape public opinion because it belonged not only to the royal family, but also to millions of people who believed old wounds had never been fully acknowledged. Earl Spencer's involvement gave the story its emotional force. Camilla's reduced authority gave it lasting consequences. Charles's signature made the decision final. Outside Kensington Palace, small groups of people quietly gathered throughout the day. Some carried flowers. Others simply stood silently facing the gates, as though the building itself had become a witness to years of unresolved history. Kensington Palace held special significance because of its lasting connection to Diana's life and William's public role, making it the emotional center of the national reaction. There were no celebrations, only reflection, curiosity, and a widespread feeling that history had finally reached a turning point. From a private room, Camilla watched the news coverage unfold. When Earl Spencer's name appeared once again, she quietly lowered the television volume. Public criticism was something she had learned to endure. But hearing Diana's brother repeatedly linked to the decision made the situation feel deeply personal. One respected evening broadcaster later described the development as the first royal consequence that feels emotional before it feels constitutional. The phrase quickly spread because it reflected exactly how many people viewed the moment. This was no longer simply about protocol. It was about history demanding recognition. Soon afterward, palace officials released a carefully written statement confirming a revised ceremonial structure. A ceremonial structure refers to the formal arrangement of royal duties, access, precedence, and official responsibilities. Although the language remained cautious, the message was unmistakable. The change was no longer speculation. It had officially taken effect. Charles had acted. Spencer had forced the reckoning. William had witnessed the beginning of a new chapter. Camilla had become the central figure in one of the monarchy's most emotionally difficult corrections. Yet when the headlines eventually faded and public debate quieted, one question remained inside the palace. What had this decision truly cost? And perhaps even more importantly, what had it finally repaired? In the final chapter of this story, the greatest consequence was never the loss of ceremonial access, royal precedence, or official influence. It was the silence that remained afterward. Charles had placed the crown above personal loyalty. Camilla came to understand that authority granted through royal tradition could also be limited by the weight of history. Earl Spencer had brought Diana's legacy back to the center of the royal conversation. And William witnessed a lesson that would shape the future of the monarchy. Following the official palace announcement, Camilla spent time alone. For the first time, she offered no resistance to the decision. The statement merely confirmed what the closed doors, altered schedules, and changing routines had already revealed. Her responsibilities had become smaller. But they had not disappeared entirely. Royal protocol simply refers to the established customs that govern rank, ceremony, access, and official conduct within the monarchy. Charles's decision demonstrated that protocol by itself was no longer enough. Public trust and emotional credibility now carried equal importance. The palace could no longer depend solely on titles while expecting history to remain silent. Camilla still stood beside the king. Yet invisible boundaries now surrounded the influence she once exercised freely. Charles carried the burden of that choice with quiet determination. After approving the final order, he believed that delaying the decision any longer would have caused even greater damage to the institution. The crown, in simple terms, represents the monarchy itself, its duty, authority, continuity, and the public confidence placed in it. Charles accepted that protecting Camilla from immediate pain might have preserved personal comfort for a while. But he also believed it could have weakened confidence in the monarchy among those who continued viewing royal decisions through the lasting memory of Diana. He did not avoid heartbreak. He simply chose the version of heartbreak he believed the crown could survive. When Earl Spencer received confirmation that the decision would remain permanent, he responded quietly. Rather than celebrating, he placed the confirmation beside Diana's photograph, treating the moment as one of reflection rather than victory. His actions were never presented as revenge. Instead, they reflected his determination to ensure that the monarchy acknowledged how unresolved history continued shaping public trust. Diana's legacy had grown beyond private remembrance. It had become a national reminder that the institution must confront difficult truths instead of hiding behind ceremony. William understood that lesson with remarkable clarity. He realized the next reign could not rely upon silence, secrecy, or emotional avoidance if it hoped to maintain lasting confidence. The monarchy endured this crisis not by denying the past, but by facing it. That became its greatest challenge and, perhaps, its greatest strength. No one left untouched. Camilla lost influence. Charles sacrificed personal peace. Spencer carried closure mixed with sadness. William inherited a lasting responsibility. Ultimately, the crown chose accountability over comfort, memory over convenience, and difficult truth over polished appearances. The revolt ended without celebration. Instead, it left behind a monarchy that was quieter, wiser, and forever changed by a past it could no longer ignore. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.